How's it going, everyone? My name is Amos, and in this video, I'm going to be evaluating and ranking every single S&P 500 income ETF to truly see which ones are the best of the best. Which unfortunately means we're not going to be covering those income ETFs with a crazy high dividend yield of like 100 or 120%, because those ones, they deserve a conversation of their own. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into it. All right, so first and foremost, let's go ahead and lay down the foundation, the rules and regulations. You don't necessarily buy into an income generating ETF for the growth, right? You buy into it for the steady cash flow that's going to be predictable every single month or every single week. So between you and me, I think the CAGR, it's kind of misleading, right? As a metric to evaluate passive income investments. So instead, we're going to be applying the following metrics to grade these income ETFs. Number one, the stability of the share price, aka capital preservation. Because sometimes you can buy into an ETF for like $50 a share, and then a year down the road, it can shrink and erode to about $25 a share. That's bad business. And then number two, the history of the dividend payouts. Is it stable? Is it shrinking? Is it consistent? Is it reliable? And then number three, whether the dividends are treated as return of capital or ordinary income. Because in my opinion, I think ROC is super awesome and it makes sense in a taxable account since you're not paying taxes on those dividends and distributions up front. That comes later on, which by the way, let me know if you guys want me to make a dedicated video going into depth about why ROC makes a lot of sense for dividend generating stocks. And then number four, the last metric is going to be assets under management, aka AUM. I'm going to refer to it as AUM in this video. It simply means how much money investors like you and I have put into that ETF. So a bigger AUM usually means more stability and less risk of the fund shutting down because it gets too small and they just can't stay alive. So as they say in Texas, bigger is better in this case for AUM. And to keep our thoughts organized, as you can see on your screen right now, we're going to be plugging and chugging the data into a spreadsheet. And before I forget, this is part one in a two-part series because in part two, we're going to be covering the exact same thing for the NASDAQ 100 income ETFs. But for this video, it's going to be the S&P 500 income ETFs, which begs the question, why do we care about an income ETF that follows this index? Well, friends and family, the S&P 500, it's the benchmark, the standard, aka the market. It's probably the most recognizable index and has all your bases covered. It's diversified. It has the AI players, the tech giants, the pharmaceuticals, financial banks, and everything in between. And as a general rule of thumb, with the options strategy on the S&P 500, which is what most of these income ETFs do, it tends to have lower volatility, which means the option premiums are going to be smaller, which equates and consequences are lower income payments. So the S&P 500, you can kind of think of it as a smaller paycheck, but you get to sleep better at night because there's less volatility. And to evaluate the S&P 500 income ETFs with one another, in our dividend experiment, we're going to begin in the month of February because that's when the latest income ETF debuted on the stock market. So to keep things as fair as possible, we're going to begin in February 2025, and we're going to pretend that we bought $100,000 of that income ETF on that date, and then we're going to be looking at the dividends paid out since that date up until right now, August the 19th. And enough talking about the spreadsheet, let's just go ahead and jump into the first one. It's going to be NEOS SPYE, SPYI. It debuted on the stock market in August in 2022. However, for the purpose of this dividend experiment, we're going to pump in $100,000 on February the 13th for $52 a share. That's how much they traded for on that day, which means we ultimately bought 1,916.8 shares of SPYE. And since February the 13th, up until this point, this ETF has paid out $5,700 in dividends. That's pretty significant, coming out of $100,000. And something to keep in mind is that the dividend distribution is every single month. And of those dividends, they're mostly ROC. which I prefer and like. And the assets under management is about $4.8 billion, which is pretty impressive. So on February 13th, the valuation of this investment was $100,000. Well, now the current valuation is $99,214, which means it did pretty much preserve your capital. It didn't really erode. And when we bake in the dividends to their current valuation, then the total return in about 6 months, your portfolio would say $104,000. So you would be in the green with the NEOS SPYE. So we're starting out with a banger, and I think it looks pretty good so far, right? And I say that because SPYE, their dividend yield is 11.8%. It's pretty darn high, but you would still be in the green. You love to see it. The next one, friends and family, is going to be the RoundHill XDTE. It debuted in the stock market in March of 2024, and they pay out their dividend every single week. And on February the 13th, each share would set you back about $50.26. So with $100,000, you would have bought 1,989 shares. And in the past 6 months, it paid out $13,000 in distributions. Pretty freaking crazy to say. And those distributions were a return of capital. You're basically getting your money back in the eyes of the government. And the AUM, the assets under management, is $400 million. Kind of small, but I'm thinking once they reach, if they ever do reach it, by the way, if they do reach $1 billion of AUM, it's going to help them to grow faster and snowball. It's like a psychological thing in the stock market. Once you know an ETF or a stock, like their market capitalization is about $1 billion, more people will invest into it. And their current cost basis, it would have gone from $100,000 back in February to now $87,000. So your money would have shrank by approximately $13,000, but you would have received about $13,000 in dividends. So your current total return, your portfolio valuation with the dividends baked in, it would be about $101,000. So you would be in the green, in the positive, by about $1,000. And on that note, can you believe that Christmas is only 4 months away? I'm kind of excited because this is going to be the first Christmas where I'm going to have my first kid. She's going to be like 2.5 months old. Yeah, it's going to be kind of weird, but I guess it's the start of a new chapter and me growing up and maturing as an individual. But all that to say, I guess going forward, my Christmas, the idea of what I have on December the 25th, it's always going to be with family, which I'm pretty excited because I grew up in a background with a broken household. We never celebrated Christmas, and let alone get a gift, right? So to be able to create my own little family and to celebrate it in a way where my children can have a memorable Christmas, dude, I'm freaking stoked. But anyways, moving right along to the next one, it's going to be YieldMax and their version of the S&P 500 Income ETF. It's called SDTY. I'm just going to refer to it as City. And it debuted on the stock market in February 6th of 2025. So if we had pumped $100,000 on that date, February 13th, at about $50.55 a share, then we would have bought about 1,978 shares. And since that point, in the past 6 months, we would have received about $11,300 in dividends, which I would argue is pretty good. However, the valuation of the $100,000 that we invested into Citi, well, it would have shrank to $89,950. And the total return in your portfolio would be almost identical to the RoundHill flavor. It'd be about $101,000. And the assets under management is only $13 million. Dude, this ETF's AUM is so small. I'm not exaggerating when I say this. I've seen GoFundMe projects with more capital than that, of $13 million. That's really, really small. And for me, I don't like seeing it that small. That's what she said. But the distributions and the dividends, it's mostly ROC. It fluctuates between like 85%, 90%, whereas the other 10 to 15%, will be calculated as ordinary dividends taxed at the higher tax bracket. And the next one, friends and family, is going to be the JPMorgan's JEPI. It debuted in the stock market in May of 2020. So out of the 4 that we've covered so far, they have the most DNA timeline in history on the stock market, which I like. However, if we invested $100,000 into them in February 13th at about $59 a share, then we would have about 1,600 shares in our portfolio. And in the past 6 months, that 1,600 shares, well, they paid out $4,200 in dividends. And that $100,000 would have transformed into $95,000. And if you marry the two, then in your portfolio, your total return would be about $99,967. So essentially, you're relatively flat if you had invested into JEPI. And by the way, I really like the fact that we're starting out in February because it would bake in the April sell-off and also calculate whether or not they rebounded. So you would see the high and the low all in one. Even though it's only a small sample of 6 months, I really like that we're starting in February. I think it's good. Now, even though in the 6 months, your total return would basically be flat, the assets under management, as you can see by that tiny little number right there, is $40.8 billion. Dude, that's huge. It's like the size of a Filipino person's calf. Doesn't matter if you're male or female, dude, they have gigantic calves. So for me, that's a huge green flag, and it shows that they're the most popular and their muscle size in the income ETF world. Unfortunately for JEPI, their distributions, as you can see, are ordinary dividends, which means it's going to be taxed at your income level and it's going to be unfavorable. Not a huge fan of that. So I'm going to tell you right off the bat, your money being relatively flat in 6 months and the dividends being classified as ordinary, that's probably my least favorite so far. I mean, you can't really argue with the data, right? So from what I'm seeing, I'm like, And the next one, friends and family, is going to be the Goldman Sachs GPIX, ticker symbol GPIX. They debuted in the stock market October of 2023, and each share would have set us back about $50.55. And if we bought $100,000 worth, then we would have about 1,978 shares in our portfolio. And in the past 6 months, it paid out about $4,000 in dividends. And here's the crazy thing. That initial $100,000 invested into GPIX, it would now be $100,700. So instead of just preserving our capital, it actually grew it by $771. And just like the JPMorgan JEPI, the dividend distribution is every single month. And the current total return, once you bake in the dividends paid out plus our current portfolio's valuation of about 1,978 shares, it would be $104,800. Boys and girls, bald men, beautiful women, dude, I love to see that. You're in the green with the Goldman Sachs GPIX, and their assets under management is $1.3 billion, which is pretty decent. At least they're not as tiny as the YieldMax SDTY. I mean, 13 million bucks. Guys, I think that's a huge eyesore for me. Like, you might only be looking at the dividends paid out, but I'm also looking at the survivability and the sustainability of that ETF. 13 million AUM is just... that's a red flag. I know I keep talking about it, but that's not good. They have to have a game plan and a mission to increase the size of their AUM. And the distributions are mostly ROC. So it's going to be taxed later on when you do eventually sell out of your position in GPIX. And then next up on the chopping board is the Global X XYLD. They debuted in the stock market in 2013. So they've been doing this strategy for more than 12 years. The tried and true battle tested. But anyways, if we bought $100,000 of XYLD on February 13th, we would have about 2,300 shares in our portfolio. And in the past 6 months, XYLD paid out $5,700 in dividends, which if you stack it up against the competition, it's somewhere in the middle. It's not the lowest and it's not the biggest. The biggest is obviously RoundHill. However, your current portfolio valuation would have shrank the most as well with RoundHill. So it's like a balancing act. You got to take all those things into consideration. That's why I put this column right here to get a more holistic picture of the dividends paid out, but also your capital preservation. That's why I think the metrics that I chose, I'm hoping that it was the most fair in evaluating an income ETF. Now, if I was evaluating United Health, Google, or Microsoft, totally different set of criteria and metrics. And when it comes to XYLD, the dividend distribution frequency is every single month, and the distributions are ROC, which I love to see. ROC, I love to see. Dude, I'm a rapper today. It might be the chain. And assets under management is $3.1 billion. So it's pretty decent across the board. However, what's not decent is that your $100,000 would have shrank to $90,000 in 6 months. And then the total return, once you bake in the dividends paid out, would be $96,400. So you would be in the red by approximately $3,600 with XYLD. That's not good. So what are my thoughts and opinions after analyzing all of the different S&P 500 income ETFs? I think individually, if you assess them by themselves, I think they would look fancy and beautiful. But when you stack them up against one another, I think it was much easier for me to pick my favorites from the bunch. Because even though they're all trying to do the exact same thing, a options strategy on the index of the S&P 500, they're not all created the same. The outcomes were pretty drastic and different. If all I cared about were the dividend distributions with a short-term focus, I think my top pick easily going to be the RoundHill XDTE, because you would have gotten $13,000 in the past 6 months. And then of course, a very close second place, YieldMax SDTY, because you would have gotten $11,300. When I say city, it reminds me of Manchester City, because I'm a Tottenham Hotspur fan, so it's like, eh. But on the flip side of those two picks, if all you care about are the dividends, I mean, your portfolio valuation of 100 grand would have shrank by a huge significant amount. And I can't just turn a blind eye to that. So if I were to apply my criteria and metrics, then by far, I think the best one out of the bunch is the NEOS SPYE, because the total return would have been $104,973. Your 100 grand would have shrank by only, what, like $800, give or take? But you would have gotten $5,700 in dividends. So it more than makes up for the fact that it shrank by about $800. And then in second place, which was shocking to me, was the Goldman Sachs GPIX. Because from my understanding, before I did this assessment, I thought the JPMorgan JEPI was going to come out on top. However, out of the bunch, they were the second worst. And I say worst objectively based on the numbers and data. The pound for pound underperformer was definitely the global X XYLD. So based on the data that we see here today, it kind of confuses me how in the dividend investing community, not a single soul, nobody talks about the Goldman Sachs GPIX. I truly think they're pretty darn beautiful. This is a really good income ETF. I think they deserve more respect. Now, between you and me, I'm a long-term vision kind of guy, so I would rather want to see my capital be preserved while getting a modest dividend. So I understand the folks that might see the RoundHill or the YieldMax variety of the S&P 500 income ETFs and liking them, but for me, I don't like the whole idea of my capital just shrinking by this much. And it's only been 6 months, which means in the next 6 months, who's to say that the capital won't shrink even further? Like the YieldMax SDTY dropping down to about 79,000, right? So it's like, But then again, friends and family, that's what makes investing so much fun. Everybody is entitled to their own opinion and preferences and methodology and strategy of how you want to invest your hard-earned money. That's just my personal take and how my brain is wired. So I would prefer to invest into the NEOS SPYE or the Goldman Sachs GPIX. And based on my understanding of the two, I truly don't think that I can go wrong with either. Now, to be fully transparent, I'm not invested into any one of these. However, if I had to pick, I would go with one of the two that I just said. And before I sign out of here, dude, this video took a ton of time and effort to compile all of the data and to extrapolate the results. So I would appreciate it a lot if you would tap like on this video. If you choose not to, it's all good. I'll talk to you guys next time. Stay safe. Good luck in the stock market. And remember, there's a part 2 coming out very soon about the NASDAQ 100 income ETFs. That's what you can expect next. Peace.